Alright, we're recording. So, that last video, what can I say but sorry, it had to be done. I had to get a bunch of stuff out of the way. That's all mentally offloaded. Now this channel can kind of reset, and I'm just going to talk about what's in front of me again, and meta stuff will be out of the way. Maybe that last video should have been its own thing, not related to the Halo Wars series, but let's be real, it's Halo Wars, you're only missing so much. So yeah, I'm back into it now, momentum is regained, one shit video you can skip if you want. Now we're going to get properly into this thing. Oh look, a cutscene, I forgot this. What do you think of this kind of intermediate design where, using this new level of detail, they try to do things like lots of heavy metal details, almost like CE on top of these guys, but with more detailed, kind of realistic models. I really think that... This looks prestigious, but I don't think it's particularly good. Things like the metallic details, even the general shape of the aliens was very much made for kind of conventional video game graphics look. Only so many polygons and so much. Yeah, I'm happy to talk over this cutscene. I'll edit it down in post because frankly this game's story is boring. It had to fit into a story that was already happening, so they just stay out of the way. Does this interest you? Be honest. What interests me looking at these cutscenes is just how they tried to do high fidelity Halo designs without really changing them, like they're almost the Combat Evolved look. This was made in like 2010 before Reach, after ODST, and they kind of decided like, yeah, the elites still basically have one fixed look, which is 2's update on 1, which is still basically the same shape. And here's our little constant action movie premise mission, and I intend to talk about this actually as a game and get into that aborted subject from the last video, which is formality and convention. This is the blow up the giant scarab mission. This is our Metropolis from Halo 2 moment. And yeah, just... what I want to talk about is convention as in like certain ways of doing things as ways that just... ways that either stick because they're good or just because we're in the habit of doing them, it doesn't matter. Just the point I make to the RPG Codex people is that there is no master way to make a video game, and we should accept each one as, you know, traditions exist within making video games. There are people doing things in certain ways just because that's how it's done, and even if that's thoughtless or arbitrary, it's not necessarily bad. Anything people have done at length for a while becomes a kind of tradition and history which we can appreciate, people interfacing back and forth within it, doing their own things as they go. Sorry, this is a lot to say under pressure, but I hope it'll make sense if I just go into this case study of the game right in front of us. There are a lot of games that look like old Final Fantasy, or games that look like Halo, for a better example. There are models of game which stuck and got repeated, and ones which didn't necessarily, even if they were in vogue for a while. And I think we can make a lot of that. Whoops. What I want to talk about is RTS as a kind of convention. What does that tell us? The kind of way that these games emerged, kind of half historical accident, half, you know, optimization, attempt to make a more fun game, half just people developing what they realized they could do and wanting to do more of it. Where I'm going with all of that is that Halo Wars is an RTS, it's what they say on the box, but more than that, it's kind of a product of a very specific cultural moment. For a while, a few things that looked like this were being made. It's kind of a Command and Conquer, the 3D installments, kind of an iteration of that moment style way of doing things, however you want to put it. There was a while where games looked like this, the kind of, you know, the 3D technology was new, and this was about what they could do, so this was the way they decided to start doing it. Sorry if this is a bit overwhelming to get into, but I thought, sorry I hit you with all the housekeeping last video, we're just going to hit you with a stream of consciousness of original video game thoughts this time. So my thinking is... Sorry, my tanks are being silly and doing different things. This works a lot better in writing, but I do want to get it out, and I should really just not worry about being definitive right now, because it's a goddamn Halo Let's Play. I'm going to make the most elaborate one ever by far. Nobody cares about this game. No matter what I do, I should just relax. Take it easy on myself, lay down the master theories in writing later. And a lot of this stuff I actually have laid down, just not here in video, but it's stuff I've been writing about lately. When I argue with people and tell them, you know, CRPGs are maybe not the best thing ever, the reason people maybe make more of CRPGs than they ought to, they kind of hype them up a bit beyond reason, is because now that flashier games exist, they feel a need to justify them. And yeah, the first way people want to justify a game like old school Fallout, Arcanum, not Deus Ex, sorry, things like Baldur's Gate, games which are very stiff, doing things which seem less free, we would prefer less restraining designs. The argument they tend to make for these old restrained models, I think, is the wrong one. They do it because they lack the language to make a case which holds water a lot better. These people like saying that their games are the best at what they do. They say, like, oh, Fallout is the most realistic game system. Everything which isn't doing old 90s RPG is ripping out detail for the casuals. Mr. Corpo Slopper wants to put microtransactions in. You know, it's all silliness, but where it goes with that is, you know, they understand that people would rather be playing games of another kind, and they're afraid of their own being left behind. And what's really lacking in video games is a way in typical language to justify something which seems not optimized. And the easy way to turn that around and kind of save things, you know, I don't like RPGs, but I think I can make the arguments that justify their place in history a lot better than these people who, you know, really, they mean the world to them, maybe a bit more than rationally they ought to. The case that you should be making for these things is that they are a form or set of conventions, they are a tradition. The way that they do everything does not necessarily make perfect on-paper sense. You cannot originally construct an argument from zero for why any particular thing should be made in that given way, but just the fact that people did start making things in that way can inherently be interesting, and yeah, anything people have been doing for a while will accrue history, and yeah, as I said in the Halo videos, especially towards the end, just this is the history of all art in general, popular junk like video games or anything else. It's people looking at people, expressing themselves, and so on. It's all interesting if you are broadly interested in people, and, you know, what is a convention? A set of expectations and ways of doing things. You know, people mainly made RPGs that way just because people expected them to, and there is absolutely nothing wrong with that ultimately, and yeah, the way Fallout is built is a product of largely just meaningless historical flukes and circumstances, and that is not something to be ashamed of. The same could be said to be true of a very respected and old form, like, say, No Theater is the extreme example I bring up. And no, I don't know anything about No Theater, actually. I am a complete Philistine, and I just bring up things which sound about fitting to suit whatever argument I'm making at any given moment. I don't care, that's just how I think and speak. If I say anything truly wrong, I'm open to being corrected on that, but I think I'm doing pretty good at the moment. Forge got knocked down, he gets back up, he's a big man, not like these other loser Marines. I spent too long upgrading that, now I have no tanks. I have these guys coming, we're doing fine. Set to normal. But yeah, I hope this argument is coming together that, yes, different ways of making games are just kind of largely products of meaningless historical circumstance and flukes, but yeah, recognizing the arbitrariness and the fact that this is not optimized, the idea of an optimized form of game, of course, gets into very big questions most people aren't comfortable with, like what is ultimately the point of doing any of this? Is a Deus Ex Vanilla-Born-like more realistic than a Fallout Vanilla-Born-like? Well, at any point in that discussion, does anybody even ask what the hell is the point of a realistic video game? I think not, because people are stupid and ultimately don't like thinking very much. I sure hope I'm not about to get all these blown up. Probably am. I seem to remember there's a bug in this level where if you put Marines in one of these towers, they can just occupy the thing's gun forever. So maybe I should try to set that up. Quick, clear the tower, people. Sorry, I'll tie this back to RTS, I swear. I'm interested in this question of RTS as a form because we can discuss this specific episode in RTS history, which absolutely nobody remembers fondly, but you know, a few people like me might revisit it every now and then. It's really just about the most dull period in RTS history. There was nothing optimal like the Fallout Vanilla-Born-like about the Command and Conquer Vanilla-Born-like. This idea of making a game where, you know, you build the base and then the guys come out and so on. Why did that become standard practice? Basically historical accident. I think it's very fair of me to suggest that. Do you disagree? I would think probably not. But ultimately, just anything that people work at a long time, it develops a creative tradition, which it can be interesting to see people play with. Of course, how do people make new games going forward relative to the conventions of Command and Conquer? If you're familiar with it, it can be fun just to recognize people playing with those, but at the same time, a tradition of playing emerges, and it can be very interesting to see how people gradually master those systems and come to take advantage of them and make a game of it. Anything multiple people are trying to win for a long time will develop a meta. Some games got more interesting than others. That's not the whole extent of this issue, but it is a big part of what makes them more or less interesting. Yep, we got the bug. I beat this level. This level's shit, don't worry, we're trying to get to the interesting one afterwards. Now I spend forever shooting this thing in the side. How fun. You guys move out. So, yeah, various historical accidents and so on, but not all conventions and traditions are equal, obviously. Not all of them last. The Command and Conquer-ish Descended game still exists in various forms. People are still playing barely updated Age of Empires 2 competitively. The same is not true of competitive Halo Wars. There is like one guy on YouTube who occasionally hosts games of Halo Wars still on his Discord or something, I don't know. And frankly, the game is not that interesting in action. It's a very dull game. Jeez, how long is this going to take to knock down? How exciting. But yes, not all traditions are equal, and they are born of accidents, circumstances, whatever. And where I was going with that whole line of thought is, I would say that broadly, this is probably one of the more boring and least, you know, interesting or charming accidents, the kind of Command and Conquer 3 period of, well, 3D emerged, and it was a tool we could use. For some uses, it became so cool, you could do so much with it, it became basically standard. But the real big advantage of making things in 3D was, of course, that, you know, you can make things feel more real, you can do, you know, like Mario goes from running along a 2D plane to a 3D castle, we have more going on and it feels more fully realized and alive. That is really just not remotely true of RTS because, of course, what's happening there is these games were already doing basically everything they wanted to, because strategy games were built with isometric graphics, which used, you know, selective implementation of detail to get a lot done with what were technically very limited resources. These were very robust, awesome games, which, yeah, they just really successfully conveyed a sense of basically everything that we use 3D for in more conventional action forms. They were doing that without it, so the addition of 3D basically gave nothing to this tradition. It was a bunch of technical obligations which actually reduced their scale on many points, while adding basically nothing people would be lastingly fond of. And so this is really just like a historical accident, like a... How do I put this? It's like if Final Fantasy The Spirits Within, the bad 3D movie, became like an established genre that people made a lot of for a while. Like, it basically has no aesthetic justification for existing beyond novelty, but I suppose you could say that it has what we might call just... What it's got is just it was technically novel for a while and everyone did it just because that's what you do, but in retrospect there was basically no innate strength to this form, and on top of that, nobody ultimately had any good ideas that are really worth revisiting the form for, so it basically died. It's a dead genre, it's a dead style, it's a dead everything. What am I saying? This is a long way of saying 3D strategy games are, and kind of always were, complete shit. 3D in this specific field of video games, isometric camera looking down on the little war men, it was kind of a solution looking for a problem, because even with sprite graphics we had games which were mechanically more three-dimensional than this. That's the point I try to emphasize when I show off or talk about Myth. That it was, you know, again, Bungie, related to Halo and all that, Bungie made a 3D, like the most 3D strategy game of all time, with very, very minimal 3D rendering. Like, they basically did terrain rendered in real 3D, and all of the rest was sprites sitting on top of that, and it was functionally 3D. It was brilliant. Whereas this game, it is visuals, it is 3D. Every single, like, little marine man is made out of polygons rather than a sprite on ground. And yeah, Myth was a more three-dimensional game than this. You've probably seen all through that video things like rockets phasing through terrain and prop objects on the surface, the way that soldiers just kind of slide across the ground like they're, you know, like little figurines sitting on top of a counter which is just sliding across a flat 2D plane. You can think of this whole game as two-dimensional, and that will actually be a more useful mental image than actually taking the 3D at its word, if that makes sense. Did I get all of the things? I think I did. Oh no, I didn't get all the power nodes. I missed one. Good on the Covenant. They hid that thing from me. I don't think I did particularly good, but I don't consider that an interesting level. The next one I do, though, so look forward to that. The game is about to get more interesting, trust me. Do we have a cutscene here? Yes. Here's Sergeant Forge in his shiny metal. If you think about it, he does look basically like a cleaned up Halo 1 Marine, like the brown coloring and the plates sitting on top. And it's not bad, like an idea of fully realizing the style. Again, I think this was made largely with production materials from a Halo movie that didn't get off the ground with Neil Blomkamp, so they were thinking how they would do this if they actually did it in live action. So it's got a lot of like tactile detail. They thought of how things would look in a human's hands. That's maybe how they would have made the gun if it was a movie. How would they stage a human fighting an elite hand-to-hand? Like this. Is it great? I don't know, but...
I'll come quietly if you let him live.
God, look how many ferns are in this scene. Oh, there's a warthog in the background as well. If that was a scene in a Neil Blomkamp movie, would you accept it? And how do you like the Spartans? They're alright. This game's cutscenes are worth a look, sort of.
fire. This is Forge.
Look, he's got a little patch on his shoulder. They put serious detail into this.
Came out of nowhere.
Like, look at that whole bridge. That's like something out of Prometheus.
Heading away from the planet.
This game's cutscenes are good, just don't listen to what they're saying and realize how boring it is. It's better if you mute them and listen to me.
We're all accounted for. Why haven't we left yet?
Why aren't you in the med bay, Sergeant?
The Professor's signal has gone to light speed,
Ooh,
headed for the
stuff
border.
is happening.
That puts it outside weapon range.
What? We have to go after her.
Sir, I can only track that transponder a few more seconds.
Ooh,
Captain!
Sir,
Decision time.
Anders represents a significant security breach.
Serena, get us underway immediately. Follow that signal.
Aye, aye, sir. So, we left a note saying we're leaving, right?
Haha. She's alright, I don't mind British Cortana. And oh shit, what's that, guys?
Where the hell are we, Serena?
Yeah, how many of you didn't know the game was going
in the
there?
middle of... Actually, I'm still working on that, sir.
Anders?
The Covenant vessel we pursued appears to have taken cover on the planet's surface. I have rough coordinates.
Any sign of other Covenant activity?
Not that I can detect. Although this world is giving off some pretty crazy readings.
I'm going to boost it. Listen to the piano that played in the last few
Get
seconds.
Forge down there.
I believe he's already aboard a Pelican, awaiting your word.
What do you think of the music as an attempt at doing kind of Halo ambience? Just those few notes struck me there. They're alright. And there's the big Halo 3 multiplayer map thing, the giant tank. And what could all of this green mist mean? Where are we? Whose territory did we blunder into? Now this is a good opportunity to talk about formality, conventions, and specifically the strengths of doing things in different ways. This level is like a classic Halo premise done in a different way. This is basically a classic Halo scene done as a 3D RTS rather than a on-the-ground first-person action shooter. And unfortunately, the point I want to make here is that the 3D RTS at this level of detail, which was basically the standard for the 2000s, is really good for almost nothing, and this level's attempt at doing one of the more memorable parts of Halo Combat Evolved, something which really carved itself into gamer culture for a very long time, just kind of doesn't hit in any notable way and is a bit dull and boring. I'm sorry to talk this down before it happens, but you know, you're watching, you can watch along with me, just make your own sense of this. Tell me if you think this is a cool level. I still don't mind it, but I think that it really kind of goes to show ultimately the shortcomings of making a game like this. It kind of begs questions of, you know, why would I enjoy this?
AKA Brutes, responsible for the attack on Harvest.
Yep, there they go. Look, it's Brutes with little models that kinda work. I don't know, the big purple plates, I think. The simple, big, colorful, primary color plates design, they made that work better on the Grunts and Elites. On the Brutes, it looks a bit not great, but they're trying. It's not terrible. All of that said, I think there is one game which really did a great job of being a early 3D RTS game and realizing its premise. That is Dawn of War. I've written about that a lot. You can go into the Discord and look up my reviews of that, or just, you know, it's in my favorite game list I made for Backlogged and so on. That game I thought was really cool and didn't look like this really, but it's broadly of a kind with it. I forget how far up we have to get before we trigger the kind of next thing in this area. This isn't going well. Sorry, I always get confused at this part of the level. There's something you're meant to do to trigger help to come here, and I forget what exactly it is. Like if I have to run past a certain point or kill a certain enemy who's flagged as like the one who triggers the next sequence. There we go, bloody hell.
Sergeant, we will flank the enemy and move to your location.
Yeah, I wasn't having a great time there, Spartan team, so thanks for that. Finally deciding to help. They've got this now, so don't worry. every single Marine die, but oh well. What do you think of the spooky outdoor mystery horror level terrain? How the trees are big and dead now, the color scheme, you know, give them credit for a few things, like the color scheme really massively changed in a dramatic way for a strategy game, and yeah, it's pretty decent. I buy that we're in a really different place.
Beacon is just up ahead. Should be easy going now.
And everyone move
Echo
up
is
and...
operational. Situation
what's
normal.
happening?
All is... Hold on. Something's... Movement. We've got movement all over. This is Echo. Help! Help! They breached our... Ah!
Echo signs are offline. Quite suddenly, I might add.
Sergeant, take a team out there and find out what's happening.
Yeah, so that Marine guy really half-assed his
India
lines,
reporting
but...
in. Elephants unpacking. Hold for... Wait. Over there. What the hell was that?
Yeah, you can kind of ruin these by
Spirit,
zooming
it's
over and just
India.
seeing how...
They've taken over. Get it! Ah!
India's signs are offline as well. How very ominous.
Okay, what I think really works about that is Serena's lines, the AI, the way she, like, plays it off in character and just has, like, a really spiffy, like, sharp, biting thing to say when something horrible happens. That's just a lot of character for what is otherwise a very, like, limp landing scene. Like, do you buy any sense of terror or, like, foreboding doom when you hear the, like, crappy little Marine line of, like, "This is Echo. Oh no, ah." Like, yeah, that's very weak, and arguably it's better, arguably it's worse that, like, I see them blink out on the mini-map here, but I can also move the camera over, and I didn't show you the first one, I did show you the second. You can actually, like, the way it works together with the game's Fog of War system and all that, like, we can actually see them getting taken by the flood. Arguably, that's kind of neat that they kind of do it in-engine, they kind of cheat, you may have noticed. Oh, my controller's having a moment. Yeah, it likes doing that. Oh, we had him for a moment. There we go. Yeah, it kind of tries not to cheat, where, like, it'll actually spawn the Marines who we're hearing die and, like, have them get overwhelmed by flood. That's kind of neat, but yeah, the way that they created, like, the movie Aliens using in-engine stuff and, like, camera filters, that's really just much more creative from the original Halo team, and arguably just the original engine with, like, its much more detailed models and, you know, the first-person view of interiors. It wasn't necessarily made to basically make a horror movie in-engine, but they could, and it worked really well, and that the game up to that point actually hadn't established a precedent of first-person cutscenes, so it was able to, like, really shock us and do something different there. Just the point I want to make broadly is that everything about the original Halo Combat Evolved setup was either very well suited to or able to be wrangled very well to create a very cool total Halo experience, while nothing about the construction of this game, if you ask me, necessarily lends itself very well to any of the more elaborate ideas that are really required to make something like a flood level work. Like, can you make...
Forge here. I believe teams Echo and India are compromised.
Yeah, this is just roughly presented.
Covenant? I'm not reading any brute signatures.
Not Covenant, sir. Something else. Something worse. Much uglier.
You might remember I specifically made a video after we covered the first flood level in Halo covering what was basically the flood level of myth. Bungie, in their own history, tried to make a horror game level using a strategy games engine at one point, and I think they did actually a pretty admirable job of that. I thought it was very cool. And yeah, here is someone else with a strategy game engine trying to do a horror level using the Bungie IP that they had lent to them very nicely, and just, yeah, like, you're watching it with me. Do you feel like this is really landing, or do you feel like it's just kind of awkward? Like, these guys look a bit too much like they're made out of plastic and not in a fun way that really lends itself to what's happening. It doesn't really feel like Like, he got picked up and thrown around, but it doesn't feel too cool. I'm just not having a great time with this. It's interesting to see how they try to make a horror level using the conventions of a fairly crappy, like, 2000s 3D horror game engine. You know, it's funny to see people experiment with any set of limitations. It can be at least a bit interesting knowing that they had certain hard limits they had to work around and they're trying their best, but... Is this really good for anything? Like, of all the ways you could make this, you wouldn't choose this, and... It's not really lastingly interesting or charming. It's kind of what I've been taking a long time. The thought I'm circuitously working my way around to is I really think that the 3D, like, men on a 2D plane RTS just sucks, unfortunately. And yeah, it was doomed to die. Like, nobody is making throwbacks to this specific moment in gaming history. There is a high-budget Command & Conquer 1 clone in progress, but I don't think anybody is going to make a new game with the marketing premise of, hey, do you remember Halo Wars? Do you like the year, like, 2009, where technology could kind of do a few things, but not super well? This kind of, like, accidental state where...
Serena, prep pods for launch.
This just feels like a really awkward historical accident of a moment where... Yeah, basically games are being made this way because the new tools came into being and we decided we wanted to use them because we had them. It was a way to get an audience with a certain set of expectations in line. Not every kind of commercialized set of instructions and general outlines is bad, like... Paul Schrader wrote a very good piece on Yakuza Films, which is linked on the forum somewhere, about how, you know, a lot of it is detail he goes into about things like how the studio were very, like, arbitrary in a lot of their demands and expectations, and a lot of things were kind of meaningless flukes. The way that the shape of the genre came to be was just, like, one executive guy thinking, like, maybe we ought to do this, that, whatever.
Well, that's new and scary. These organisms are interesting.
There were more of us in our platoon. We all scattered when it hit the fan.
Our database has nothing on their origins, or, well, anything about them, really. At first glance, they appear to be a species of
Original
virulent
analysis of the
organisms
flood
that
from
thrive
these
on
characters. I'll just let that run out.
sentient life of sufficient biomass.
Nothing super interesting.
Serena, you ever hear the phrase too much information?
Good one, Sergeant Xbox 360. Yeah, this is just not a super interesting setup. It's, yeah, as I was saying, like, some forms really developed into interesting and rich traditions which people could really get playful with and have a lot of fun with. It's fun seeing how people do different things in different ways. Others, they're just kind of filler episodes in history where basically nothing ever happened to justify the whole moment, and the 3D RTS game is that, like, not a single one of these games is really aesthetically justified or fun to play to the point people stick with it. The closest thing to one is probably actually Halo Wars. This is a game that, you know, I have to admit I am revisiting it, but it's because it's related to far more interesting works is why we're here. We are looking at this relative to Halo 4 and the other games, how the old ones were so interesting and rich, and this is just kind of Halo worked into one of the more boring frames in video game history, unfortunately. Let's just camp these things out next to the base to serve as extra guns.
Yes, sir. Ready. Into position. I'm going. Shoot it up.
These ODSTs, we rescued them is the premise of the level so they can stay at base and stay alive.
Deploying. Ready to deploy.
Now, what was I saying? Yes, these are boring, basically. What I've been doing lately is playing a lot of kind of intermediate, early tech, early 3D action games, as opposed to these kind of, what you might call, yeah, just the strategy ones, basically. The thing about these strategy games is they're not really strategic, and they don't do scale particularly well. Like, Look at what passes for a battle in Halo Wars. You've got like at most a few dozen guys and a few vehicles on the ground fighting. That's the scale we had by like Halo 2, so really, like when we say scale, we mean things like basically an epic battle scenario thing, even if the game isn't necessarily strategic. But the early 3D games weren't even really good at that, so they aren't really like big battle simulators relative to their contemporary action peers, so rather than a true strategic perspective, by strategic I mean like bird's eye battle view trying to make an action movie more than other games could do at the time, which is what a game like Myth was doing, trying to be an action movie. This isn't really grander in scope than playing a Halo campaign that plays out from a on foot or vehicle perspective, so what the 2000s RTS with all of its limitations ended up doing was basically making action games which take place from above like 10 guys who you're following, which, yeah, I just think it was very lame. We just killed one of the big head exploding ones, which is kind of funny. It's neat to see that guy from another perspective, but again, like, does he even look that different? Like, different enough to be, like, really interesting or notable? Like, if he was an Age of Empires 2 style sprite, that would probably be more interesting than just what's basically a slightly lower detail 3D model. Like, we can't really appreciate the three-dimensionality or the scale of the premise particularly well here. This really is a master of none perspective. If it's stuck around, people might have found ways to make notably interesting games broadly like this, and yeah, again, I think that basically the one interesting example of a 3D RTS is Dawn of War, for reasons I might go into when I make a video on that eventually, but yeah, the various early 3D action games, rip-offs of more famous things that lasted. A lot of those are still cool because, for one, they had better ideas. It was a better moment in the industry's history where people were experimenting more and taking cues from more interesting things. By the 360, things are really kind of centralized and hanging on for dear life in a very unfortunate and uninteresting way. It's like, nope, we can't do interesting ideas, we need to make what'll sell to stay alive. But yeah, like early PS2, you had like really weird experimental premises, even if it's like, say, a Resident Evil ripoff like one of the games I played recently. It'll still come out quite interesting just because, for one, like, the very conventional 3D action game premise, third-person action man with a gun, whatever, that's inherently more fun to play with and a more fun way to explore what you might call a typical genre premise. Like, one of the games I played recently was Extermination, which was one of the first games worked on by Swery, the famous guy who would go on to make Deadly Premonition and a few other big-name, prestigious, respected things. This game was very cool, and it was what you might call an aesthetically justified game, a game you play for the premise broadly, but also an understanding of how the mechanics and just the kind of general form, the standard thing. It's a 3D Resident Evil game, kind of like Resident Evil Code Veronica. It's kind of a stiff, very video game premise. Mechanically, it's doing things that you would expect it to do in line with the tradition of things being done a certain way, which is what I mean when I say formal in relation to video games. Sorry if I've gotten that across poorly up to now. Yeah, and by the way, you're basically invincible to the goddamn Flood if you make enough Hornets, especially in these early levels with them, just to spoil the fun here. But yes, and a lot of what are considered mediocre or forgotten early 3D games, because the kind of general 3D action game form was such an effective setup, you know, frame and foundation, a lot of those games are still interesting even if the 3D action game part is boring. I wrote a thread on the forum, Video Games Are Actually Bad, in which I kind of laid this out as one cohesive theory. And I really should just point you guys to things I've written like I'm icy calm, rather than try to explain them on the spot, because I'm basically challenging myself to impromptu recap something I've already done better because I had time to think about it at the time when I was writing it. But Anyway, what was I saying? Where am I going? Yes, a lot of 3D action games which don't necessarily stand out or justify themselves as 3D action games. I wouldn't recommend Extermination on that ground. I would still recommend Extermination for the PlayStation 2. It's a very interesting game. As a kind of total aesthetic whole, the kind of broad premise, a Resident Evil spin-off thing more related to the Thing, that's kind of interesting, but that explored how they do that through the kind of typical PS2 action game elements, the way that they kind of spin off of what was expected and normal at the time. I think that that's quite charming. Like, the fun of the experience is seeing how they take what is normal for a video game and decide, like, okay, how do we make it fit the specific thing we're trying to do here? You know, again, it's playing with the formal conventions and expectations. I think that, yes, they don't do anything stunningly interesting. They didn't reinvent the wheel. I'm not saying all 3D action games about controlling a guy in a scenario with a gun need to go and take cues from Extermination necessarily, but Extermination is charming to see how the premise and the conventions and expectations, what I broadly call the formalities, how all of that met and became something new in a total way I found very interesting. And that is ultimately something that I can't really say for Halo Wars, or frankly any 3D strategy game. I don't think any of these really succeeded in standing out from everything else that existed. The baseline 3D strategy game is boring, and even something as extreme as trying to incorporate all of the weird mechanical elements of Halo, the quirks of its setting. Like, we have bouncy warthogs, we have Hornets, we have ODSTs, we have the goddamn Flood, and still the total experience is just not that interesting. But still, I'll give it credit. It is more interesting. This is about as interesting as the game gets, just trying to see how the novel aesthetic challenge pushes them to do more with a very boring set of parts, expectations, conventions. But ultimately, is the result cool? Is this a game I recommend to you? Not really. It's Halo Wars. It's not particularly beloved or famous for a reason, and that reason is that it's just kind of boring. You can only do so much with the bare 3D stock, everything is a disc moving on a 2D plane with no real friction or momentum or physics or whatever. Just a very boring mechanical setup. The aesthetic premise of Halo I do think is interesting, of course, but only so much so. I'm not like madly interested in the idea of anything branded Halo. I actually think that basically everything you could do was well and truly done by this point. The few novels expanded things out a bit and iterated upon the key ideas, but Combat Evolved alone, we're like 90% done. I liked a few more iterations, just dragging things out a bit and going to some interesting places. By here, we are really just at the kind of Halo shit point in time, where I can just say something is shit with Halo on it, and it's mildly interesting to see a warthog presented in another way. And this level, yeah, this is our encounter with the Flood. It's not quite as iconic as the Halo Combat Evolved level, is it? Sorry if this is boring you, but this game is really just not that interesting in my opinion.
We need those units intact. Bring all elephants back to base, Sergeant.
Bring the elephants back to base, you got it. We've almost beaten this level, and then I'll call it.
Let's get everyone back to the base. Move, move, move.
And here's our little survival convoy bit getting the elephant back, but I've got this level under control, so it's no real threat. Get 'em. I appreciate they gave the Flood buildings and stuff, even though they didn't need them. They weren't a full faction. That may have been a plan at some point, but, you know, they have a decent sense of presence in the game. They have their own rules and stuff they can do. That's alright. Again, it's like, as a matter of form and convention, because this is a strategy game, what happens is everyone has to be broken down into a set of units, mechanics, counters, production centers and so on. You know, all because of that formal legacy of Command and Conquer, which didn't have to be a thing. Strategy games could have come out any number of ways, but they came out this way, so things like unit types and production centers, that's what we're working with, and trying to see someone work Halo into that. Is it interesting? Sort of. Enough for me to think, why don't I go back to this game every now and then? I'll give it a look. It's not mind-blowingly interesting, but it's something. And I hope you didn't mind this video, but yeah, we're just getting back into things, and Halo Wars, it's a very nice, easy, low-friction subject I can just throw myself back into to maybe not make the most stunningly interesting videos ever, but, you know, this is stuff I can just do. I want to do something for you, I want to build the momentum back up, and I like having finished projects on the channel, so we'll bash this game out the next few videos. It's 15 levels total, that was 8. If I do like 2 a video, this will take me no time if I do them like each night. And I should try to do that. I really have no excuse. I owe it to you guys. We'll do this, and then, yeah, I'm open to suggestions. Leave comments, let me know what you want me to do next, and yeah, I'll try to make some more serious stuff. I'll keep writing, I'll keep thinking, and trying to advance the video game science. I'm sorry if I'm rusty. I really did just leave this way too long, didn't I? Well, we'll call this one here. I hope you enjoyed having me back and listening to that. I hope it wasn't total gibberish. Check out the Discord. I'll link that in the description again. And from there, ask about the forum if you're not there. And a lot of the ideas which came out rough here, you can probably find a lot better in writing in one of those 2 places. And yeah, I'm happy to share all of it with you. So if you stuck with this, thank you. It means a lot. And yeah, we'll call this one here.